The military capability review had been on the Council calendar for 4 months. It was not an unusual item. The Galactic Council had been running capability reviews on a rotating schedule for 300 years without interruption. Every member species submitted to the process. No exceptions, no special treatment regardless of size or seniority. The review was designed to maintain transparency between member civilizations, to ensure the Council had accurate information about the military capabilities present within its membership, and to provide a formal record that contributed to the stability of the collective security framework the Council had spent centuries building. It was, in short, paperwork. Important paperwork, conducted in person with a standard format and a standard duration and a standard outcome that got filed in the standard location and reviewed by the standard committee. 300 years of procedure had made it smooth and predictable and about as exciting as most things that had been done the same way for 3 centuries tended to be. The notification went out to humanity's diplomatic office 8 weeks in advance. Standard lead time. The scheduling coordinator who sent it had processed 47 of these notifications in her career, and she sent this one with the same efficient indifference she brought to all of them. Species name, review date, format specifications, docking authorization request form, confirmation deadline. The confirmation came back within 48 hours. Also standard. It was signed by Admiral Dana Webb, listed as humanity's senior military representative for the review, and it confirmed attendance, confirmed the format, confirmed the date, and included the completed docking authorization form. The docking authorization form had a field for vessel specifications. Most species filled this in with a diplomatic transport designation. Small ships, single-vessel delegations, the kind of craft that docked at the Council Station's standard berths without requiring any special handling. The coordinator processed these forms efficiently and without reading them in detail because the details were almost never interesting. She processed humanity's form the same way and logged the confirmation and moved on to the next item on her list. The Council Docking Authority received the vessel specifications form 3 days later when the authorization routing completed. The officer who logged it glanced at the specifications field, made a note in the system, and flagged it for the senior docking coordinator with a brief attached message that said the berth assignment might need to be reviewed. The senior docking coordinator looked at the specifications. She looked at them for a while. Then she reassigned the berth request to the External Approach Registry, the section that handled vessels too large for standard station docking, and sent a query back to humanity's office asking for confirmation that the specifications were correct. The confirmation came back the same day. Yes, the specifications were correct. Yes, the vessel was the one they intended to bring. Yes, they were aware it was larger than a standard diplomatic transport. They appreciated the Council's flexibility on the berth assignment. The senior docking coordinator filed everything correctly and thoroughly and did not think about it again until Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning the Council Station was running at its normal operational tempo. The review was scheduled for 1,000 hours. The standard pre-review preparations were underway: chamber setup, documentation preparation, the quiet efficient movement of staff through the corridors that preceded any formal proceeding. In the Docking Authority control room the morning shift had come on at 0600. The duty officer, a Vehari woman named Coordinator Vel who had worked the morning shift for 6 years and who had a reputation for unflappable professionalism, settled in with her coffee and her display and began the morning check sequence. Approach traffic was light. 2 freight vessels inbound on standard routes. A diplomatic transport from the Thessari system arriving for unrelated business. The scheduled approach window for humanity's review vessel was logged for 0830, early arrival, within normal parameters for a 1000 proceeding. Vel checked the freight vessels. Checked the Thessari transport. Checked the approach corridor status. Drank some of her coffee. At 0823 the approach sensors picked up the emergence signal from the jump point at the outer marker. Standard procedure. She pulled up the signature on her display and began the routine confirmation sequence, cross-referencing the emergence signature against the logged authorization, checking the approach vector, confirming the identification beacon. The identification beacon confirmed. Humanity's vessel. Right on schedule. She looked at the size reading on the display. She put her coffee down. She looked at the size reading again with the specific attention of someone who has seen an anomalous number and is checking whether the anomaly is in the number or in their own reading of it. The number was the same the second time. She pulled up the specifications form that had been filed with the docking authorization. She found the specifications field. She compared the figure in the field to the figure on her display. They matched. Exactly. She sat with this for a moment. 6 years of morning shifts. Hundreds of approach authorizations processed. She had a very well-calibrated sense of what numbers in the approach display meant in practical terms, what they looked like when they resolved into a visible object in the approach corridor, what the station's observation deck showed when a vessel of a given specification came into range. She knew what the number she was looking at meant in practical terms. She set her coffee aside completely and pulled up the priority message system and typed a message to the council chamber floor coordinator. She did not use technical language because the technical language would take longer to compose and the message needed to be sent now. She did not use formal phrasing for the same reason. She typed, "You need to come to the observation deck right now." She sent it. Then she looked back at her display where the approach signature of the ANS Resolute was moving through the outer corridor at standard approach speed, calm and unhurried, running its running lights like any vessel on a courtesy approach. Getting larger. Still getting larger. She picked up her coffee, remembered she had set it aside and left it where it was. The observation deck of the Galactic Council Station was not a small space. It had been designed 300 years ago with the specific intention of impressing visiting delegations. A wide curved viewport that looked out across the approach corridor, high ceilings, the kind of architectural confidence that said the civilization that built this room had been doing this for a long time and intended to keep doing it. It had hosted the arrivals of hundreds of vessels from dozens of species across 3 centuries of council operation. Heads of state had stood at that viewport. Historic diplomatic moments had been witnessed from that deck. The space had seen things. 41 people were standing at the viewport when the message came through from the docking authority. They had come quickly, the priority message had used language that did not leave room for a relaxed response, and the people who ran a significant fraction of the known galaxy's diplomatic infrastructure were, whatever their other qualities, very good at reading the difference between routine and not routine. They arrived at the deck at various speeds from various parts of the station and arranged themselves at the viewport in the organic way of a crowd that was still processing why exactly they were there and what they were supposed to be looking at. The answer became apparent without anyone having to explain it. The jump point at the outer marker was a standard transit aperture. Council stations positioned them at specific coordinates to manage approach traffic, and the aperture at this station's outer marker had been used thousands of times. Ships came through it regularly. The Thessari diplomatic transport had come through it 40 minutes ago without anyone sending emergency messages to the chamber floor. The ANS Resolute came through it differently. Not in the physics of the transit, the jump was standard, the emergent signature was clean, the approach vector was exactly what had been filed in the authorization. All of that was routine. What was not routine was what the viewport showed in the seconds and minutes after the emergence. Something was coming through the aperture. It was still coming through. It kept coming. The human ship moved at standard approach speed, deliberately unhurried, running its navigation lights in the standard configuration for a courtesy approach to a council station, broadcasting its identification beacon on the standard frequency. Everything about its operational behavior was correct and professional and considerate of station protocol. Its size was something else entirely. The problem with very large things seen from a distance was that the mind kept interpreting them as closer than they were. When a normal-sized vessel came through the approach corridor, the brain calibrated it correctly within a few seconds, registered the size, registered the distance, resolved the relationship between the two into a complete picture. With the Resolute, this process kept failing. The brain would begin its calibration and then the ship would keep resolving into something larger than the calibration had accounted for and the process would have to start over. It was still happening when the ship had cleared the jump point entirely and was moving through the approach corridor under its own drive at speeds that made the size even more difficult to process because you could see the velocity relative to the background and the velocity itself was not small and the thing moving at that velocity was. The Oresi ambassador's hands found the railing without him looking down to find it. Both hands, grip firm, the automatic physical response of a person whose brain is sending signals that the ground might not be entirely reliable. The Oresi were a spacefaring species with 400 years of history. They had built some of the largest civilian vessels in Council space. Their ambassador had been on this deck for the arrivals of a dozen significant vessels across a career that spanned 30 years. Both hands. On the railing. Without looking. The Thessari representative, a senior diplomat named in the record as Envoy Kala, 12 years in the Council role, known professionally for a composure so thorough it had become something of a running observation among the other delegations, had stopped moving at some point in the first 30 seconds. Stopped completely. Weight settled, hands at her sides, no visible response beyond the absolute stillness of someone whose processing was fully occupied and had no resources left for secondary functions like shifting weight or blinking at normal frequency. Third attaché Vaughn of the Drenali delegation was junior enough that he was standing at the back of the group rather than at the front railing. He had a clear enough sight line to the viewport to see what was happening, and he had the specific professional training of a Drenali diplomatic attaché, which included, as all Drenali diplomatic training included, a grounding in technical analysis and rapid numerical assessment. He looked at the Resolute for approximately 45 seconds. Then he pulled out his personal computation unit and ran the numbers. Not slowly. The Drenali educational system produced people who could do this kind of calculation quickly, and he was not an exception. He was done in under a minute. He looked at the result on the unit's display. He put the unit in his pocket. He looked at the viewport again, where the Resolute was still moving through the approach corridor, still getting no smaller from this distance because it was still very far away and still very large. He said nothing to anyone. Not because the numbers weren't significant. Because they were more significant than anything he had calculated in his professional career, and he needed several minutes in which he was not expected to speak or respond to anyone before he could decide what he was going to do with that information. The rest of the deck was similarly quiet. There was no panic. These were senior diplomatic professionals representing some of the most established civilizations in the galaxy, and panic was not something they did in public regardless of what their internal states were doing. But the quality of the silence on that observation deck was different from the quality of silence that preceded a normal arrival. Normal arrivals produced polite attention. People watching a scheduled event with the mild interest of officials performing a protocol. This silence was different. This was 41 people from 17 species standing at a viewport and watching something that was requiring them to update a significant number of assumptions they had been carrying about humanity for 11 years, and finding that the update process was taking longer than they were accustomed to because the scale of the revision was larger than they were accustomed to. The Resolute moved through the approach corridor, and the navigation lights blinked their patient and courteous intervals, and the identification beacon broadcast its steady and polite signal, and the whole thing proceeded with the calm professionalism of a crew that had done this approach 100 times in training and knew exactly what they were doing. From the observation deck, 41 people watched it come. Nobody spoke for a long time. Eventually the Oresi ambassador, still at the railing, said something in his own language to the attaché standing beside him. His tone was the controlled and measured tone of someone choosing their words carefully, because the words that were actually occurring to him were not appropriate for a professional setting. The attaché responded in the same tone. At the back of the group, third attaché Vaughn was looking at the middle distance and not at the viewport, and was doing the particular expression of someone having a conversation with themselves that they were not ready to have with anyone else yet. The Resolute finished its approach and moved into the holding position that had been assigned to it, the external approach registry berth, well clear of the station's standard docking infrastructure, because the standard docking infrastructure was not dimensioned for this, and settled there with the quiet confidence of something that knew it fit where it was supposed to be, even if where it was supposed to be had required some creative reclassification of available space. On the deck the silence continued for another moment. Then everyone started talking at once in their various languages, and the professional composure of the session reassembled itself around the conversation, and people began doing what senior diplomatic professionals did when they encountered something unexpected. They started processing it collectively through the language of their work. But the grip on the railing had happened. The stillness had happened. The calculation in the pocket had happened. And every person on that deck knew that what they had just watched come through the jump point had changed the shape of something important. They were just still working out what exactly that something was. The council chamber was a serious room. Not intimidating in any theatrical sense. There was nothing aggressive about the architecture, nothing designed to overwhelm visitors or signal dominance through scale. It was serious in the way that rooms become serious when genuinely important decisions have been made in them for a very long time. The circular table at the center seated 17 delegations. The lighting was even and clear. The acoustics were designed so that a voice at normal speaking volume reached every seat without distortion. 300 years of council proceedings had happened in this room, and the room carried that weight in a way that was difficult to articulate but immediately apparent to anyone who sat in it. Admiral Dana Webb stood at the presenter's position at the head of the table and set up her materials with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was not nervous about what she was about to present. She was not nervous. This was apparent to everyone in the room within the first 60 seconds, and it was one of several things about Admiral Webb that the council members would find themselves thinking about afterward. She was not performing composure the way people performed composure when they were actually managing an elevated state underneath it. She was simply not elevated. She had come to conduct a standard capability review in the standard format, and she was going to do exactly that. She pulled up the first slide. The format was the council's own, the standard template used for all member species capability reviews, the same template that had been used for 300 years. Species designation, vessel classification, Technical specifications by category. Drive systems first, then defensive capabilities, then offensive systems, then operational parameters. Clean, organized, scannable. The Titan class designation appeared on the slide under vessel classification. Nobody in the room said anything, but the Oresi ambassador shifted slightly in his seat in the way of someone adjusting to a change in the temperature of a room. Webb walked through the drive systems first. The Titan class used a modified dual-core propulsion arrangement that produced specific output figures she cited clearly and moved on from without embellishment. The figures were large. She did not note that they were large. She went to the next slide. Defensive arrays. She covered the layered shielding architecture, the point defense network, the hull composition and its resistance ratings across the relevant energy and kinetic categories. She answered 2 technical clarification questions from the Drenali delegation's senior attaché, precise questions competently asked, with precise and competent answers. Then she moved to the next slide. Weapons complement. The chamber was paying a different quality of attention by the time she reached this slide. Not disrupted, nobody had interrupted, nobody had reacted visibly in a way that broke the formal frame of the proceeding. But the attention had shifted from the polite professional attention of officials fulfilling a procedural obligation to something more focused and more careful. The kind of attention you paid when you were processing information that was coming in faster than your existing framework was built to handle it. Webb presented the weapons systems with the same organized clarity she had brought to everything else. Primary arrays, secondary systems, the targeting architecture, the operational ranges. She cited the numbers in the same tone she had used for the drive specifications. Not minimizing, not emphasizing. Just accurate. She moved to operational range and crew complement and finished the standard presentation format exactly where the template specified it should finish. Then she asked if there were questions. There were questions. The Oresi ambassador went first. He was a senior figure, 2 decades in the council role, known for a diplomatic style that was measured and thorough and that rarely revealed more of his internal state than he intended. He asked how long the Resolute had taken to construct from initial build authorization to operational status. Webb told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how many Titan-class vessels were currently in active service across humanity's fleet. Webb told him. He looked at the table for a brief moment and then back at her. He asked how many were currently under construction at human shipbuilding facilities. Webb told him that as well. The chamber had been getting quieter across the sequence of those 3 questions in the way that rooms get quieter when each new piece of information is landing somewhere significant and the people receiving it are doing more internal processing and less external commentary. After the 3rd answer, the chamber reached a quality of silence that was qualitatively different from the silence of attention. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just had their model of a situation substantially revised and were holding the revision carefully while they worked out what it meant. 3rd Attaché Vaughn, who had put his computation unit in his pocket on the observation deck and had been carrying his calculation since then, was looking at a fixed point on the table surface and appeared to be confirming something. The Thessari envoy Kala, who had been still on the observation deck and who had recovered her composure thoroughly by the time the formal session began, leaned forward slightly. She had a particular quality of attention that Webb had noticed early in the session. A focused, analytical look that processed things quietly and quickly and did not show its working on the surface. She asked why. Not with hostility. Not with any edge that made the question into anything other than what it was. A genuine request for information that the specifications slide had not addressed. Why had humanity built something of this scale? What was the reasoning? What had the assessment been that produced this as the output? Webb looked at her for exactly 1 second. In that second she was doing what she had been doing throughout the session. Not calculating her answer for diplomatic effect, not selecting language designed to manage the room's response. Just finding the accurate answer and preparing to deliver it in plain language. She said, "We looked at the galaxy and decided it seemed prudent to be prepared." 12 words. No elaboration. No qualification. No diplomatic softening or strategic framing. Just the answer to the question that had been asked, delivered in the same businesslike tone as everything else she had said in the past hour. The chamber was quiet. Not briefly quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in and stays because nobody has yet found the thing to say that would be worth breaking it for. 17 delegations sitting with 12 words that were simple enough to understand immediately and large enough in their implications to require considerably more than immediate understanding to fully process. Webb waited. She was good at waiting. She had the patient stillness of someone who has said what they came to say and is genuinely comfortable letting the room take whatever time it needs. The Oresi ambassador eventually said something to the senior member of his delegation in a very low voice. The senior member responded equally quietly. The Drenali attaché and third attaché Vaughn exchanged a brief look that communicated several things between two people who had been working together long enough to communicate efficiently. The Thessari envoy Kala looked at Webb for a long moment. Then she looked at the specifications still displayed on the presentation slide. Then she looked at her own hands on the table in the way of someone giving themselves a moment before they decided what to say next. She decided not to say anything next. She sat back slightly and the session continued. Webb answered 4 more technical questions from different delegations, all of them precise, all of them answered precisely, and then the formal review procedure reached its documented conclusion and she thanked the council for their time and began collecting her materials from the presenter's position. The chamber stayed quiet around the activity of her packing up. It was still quiet when she walked to the door. It remained quiet for a significant period after the door closed behind her. Outside in the corridor, Admiral Webb walked back toward the docking bay where the Resolute was waiting and thought about the drive back and the debrief she would need to file and the coffee she had been looking forward to since about slide 3. Behind her in the chamber 17 delegations from 17 civilizations sat with their calculations and their revised models and 12 words that were going to require a considerable amount of thinking before anyone in that room was satisfied they had fully understood what they meant. We looked at the galaxy and decided it seemed prudent to be prepared. 12 words. Very clear. Not remotely simple. The message went out to all delegations at 11:47. Emergency closed session. Council chamber. Immediate attendance required. The message used the specific procedural language that designated a session as non-optional, language that had been used 11 times in the Council's 300-year history and that every senior diplomat in the building recognized on sight. Every ambassador was in their seat by 12:03. 16 minutes from message to full attendance. The previous record for an unscheduled full session was 2 hours and 14 minutes, set during an actual border incident 40 years ago involving 3 member species and a disputed transit corridor. The coordinators who managed the chamber logistics noted the 16 minutes in the session record and did not comment on it, but the noting was its own comment. The chamber doors closed. The Oresi ambassador opened the session without the standard procedural preamble. He was a measured and formal person by professional nature, and he had been in this role long enough that the formal opening of a session was as automatic as breathing. You skipped it? That alone told the room something about where they were. He asked, in a voice that was working carefully to stay at its normal register, whether anyone present had been monitoring human industrial output data over the preceding decade and had simply not carried the analysis through to its logical endpoint. He asked it as a genuine question. He was not being rhetorical. He wanted to know the actual answer because the actual answer was relevant to what the session needed to accomplish. The silence that followed was informative. It was not the silence of people who had no idea what he was referring to. It was the specific silence of people who had seen something and had made a particular kind of decision about it, the decision that the thing they had seen was probably not as significant as a full analysis would make it look and that a full analysis was therefore not the most efficient use of their time. The silence of people who had taken a number, placed it in a lower priority category and moved on. Several sets of eyes moved to the table surface in the way that eyes move when a question has been asked that people would prefer to answer as vaguely as possible. The Thessari envoy Kala did not look at the table. She looked at the Oresi ambassador directly and said that her office had reviewed the output figures 18 months ago and had flagged them as notable but had assessed the growth trajectory as consistent with a developing industrial economy rather than as indicative of a specific military program. She said it with the clean precision of someone who believed in accurate accounting of their own analytical record even when that record was uncomfortable. The Oresi ambassador acknowledged this and looked at the rest of the table. 2 more delegations offered similar accounts. The numbers had been present. The full implication of the numbers had not been pursued. Third attaché Vaughn had been sitting quietly at the outer ring of seats. His position as a junior member of the Drenali delegation placed him there rather than at the main table. He had been quiet since the observation deck. He had been quiet through the capability review. He had been quiet through the walk from the chamber to the corridor and back. He had been carrying his calculation in his pocket for the better part of 4 hours and had spent that time getting comfortable enough with what it said to share it. The senior Drenali representative nodded to him. Vaughn stood. He read the calculation out. Not all of it. The full calculation was 12 lines and he summarized the methodology briefly and then gave the relevant outputs. He was precise and fast and his voice was level in the way of someone who had processed the alarming part of the information hours ago and was now passed it into the analytical stage. The chamber went through several distinct stages in the 20 minutes that followed. The first stage was the stage of people checking the calculation. 3 delegations had technical staff present who ran parallel assessments on their own systems. 2 of them finished within 4 minutes and confirmed. The third took 8 minutes and confirmed with a marginal variance that did not affect the conclusion. The conclusion was this. Based on documented human industrial output across the preceding decade, cross-referenced against known construction parameters for vessels of the Titan-class scale and complexity, the manufacturing infrastructure humanity had quietly developed was not consistent with a single vessel program. It was not consistent with a small fleet program. It was consistent with something considerably more ambitious than either of those things, and the Resolute, sitting in the external approach berth outside the station right now, was not the story. The Resolute was the visible part of the story. The infrastructure that had built the Resolute was the actual story, and that infrastructure had been growing steadily and documentably for a decade while the Council had been categorizing humanity as a junior member working on finding its footing. The second stage was quieter than the first. The quiet of a room full of experienced people sitting with an error of assessment that was significant enough that sitting with it was the necessary first step before any productive conversation could happen. The Oresi ambassador let the quiet run for a while. He was experienced enough to know that rushing past this stage produced worse discussions than letting it complete. The third stage was where the session actually began. It ran for 3 hours. The conversation was focused in a way that the Council's proceedings were not always focused. The normal diplomatic rhythms of careful positioning and managed disclosure and the various strategies that senior representatives deployed in collective discussions were largely absent. What replaced them was something more direct and less comfortable. People saying what they actually thought because what they actually thought was too significant to manage around. The Drenali senior representative said that the assessment failure was structural rather than individual, that the Council's framework for evaluating junior member development was calibrated for predictable development trajectories and that humanity's trajectory had not been predictable, and the framework had not flagged this because the framework was not designed to flag what it did not expect to see. The Thessari envoy said that the output data had been publicly available, that humanity had not hidden it, that it had simply not been analyzed with the assumptions that would have made its significance apparent because those assumptions, that a junior member species might be building at this scale and this pace, had not been part of the analytical framework. The Oresi ambassador said what the room had been moving towards since the session opened. He said it plainly because 3 hours in the plain version was the only version that served any purpose. He said, "We built our relationship with humanity on an assessment of humanity that was wrong. Not falsified by them. Wrong by us. We decided what they were based on where they started, and we did not revise the decision as the evidence changed because we were not looking at the evidence with the right questions." The chamber was quiet after that. A junior council staff member who had been present for the session as note-taker would write in their personal record that evening that it was the first time in their professional experience they had heard an ambassador of the Oresi say plainly that the Oresi had made a mistake. They would note that the rest of the chamber had received the statement without visible surprise. They would note that the silence after it felt less like shock and more like recognition. The session concluded without a formal resolution. The procedural outcome was a decision to reconvene the following morning with prepared position papers from each delegation addressing the question of how the Council's relationship with humanity should be restructured given the revised assessment. The Oresi ambassador sat at the table for several minutes after the chamber cleared. The senior staff coordinator waited at the door. He was looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of a very experienced person doing the work of updating a model they had held for a long time. Eventually he stood. He told the coordinator to make sure the session record was complete and accurate and filed before end of day. She said it would be. He walked out of the chamber into the corridor where the business of the station was continuing at its normal pace around the emergency that had just happened inside the room. In the external approach berth, the Resolute sat at its assigned position, navigation lights on standard idle configuration, broadcasting its identification beacon on the standard frequency, waiting with the patient stillness of a very large thing that was in no particular hurry. It had been there all afternoon. It would be there in the morning. It was not going anywhere. The request came through the Council's formal communication system at 0840 the following morning. Admiral Dana Webb, Senior Human Military Representative, requesting a final brief session with the full Council prior to the Resolute's departure. Standard format request, filed through the correct procedural channel, worded in the polite and correct language of someone who knew how the system worked and was using it properly. The approval came back in 4 minutes. The council's scheduling coordinator processed the approval and noted the response time in the administrative log without comment because commenting on it would have required her to also explain it, and she was not entirely sure she could explain it in language that fit the standard log format. 4 minutes. The previous fastest approval for a junior member session request had been 11 days. The standard processing window was 3 to 4 weeks. 4 minutes was not a processing time that the existing administrative framework had a category for. She created a new log category and filed it there and moved on. The chamber was full when Webb arrived. Not just the ambassadors, the full delegations, senior staff, the various advisors and attaches who had been part of the previous day's proceedings. The note-taker from the emergency session was in his usual position at the side desk. Third attaché Vaughn was in the outer ring where junior staff sat. The Oresi ambassador was at the main table with the settled and attentive posture of someone who had made peace with a difficult day and had come back for what came next. Webb set her materials at the presenter's position. She did not have many materials. This was not a technical presentation. She had a single page of notes that she glanced at once and then set face down on the surface next to her because she had been through the 3 points enough times in her head that the page was not necessary. She looked at the room. She said she was going to make 3 points and she would keep them brief because the council's time was valuable and what she had to say did not require length to be clear. The first point was about why. She said humanity had built the Titan class because they had looked at the galaxy honestly and early and had made a decision based on what they saw. The galaxy was large. It was complicated. It contained civilizations with centuries more development than humanity, with established interests and established frameworks and established ways of doing things that had been built without humanity's input and that did not necessarily account for humanity's interests in any particular way. This was not a criticism, it was just an accurate description of the situation humanity had found itself in when it first made contact with the wider galactic community. Given that situation, she said, humanity had asked themselves a straightforward question. What kind of position did they want to be in? Dependent on the goodwill and continued goodwill of established powers who had no particular obligation to maintain that goodwill, or secure through their own capability in a way that made the question of others' goodwill less structurally critical. They had answered the question the way they answered most questions, practically and without sentiment. She said this without apology and without aggression, just as the explanation it was. The second point was about what the Titan class was and was not. She said the Resolute and its active sister ships were defensive in their operational design and their strategic deployment. The weapon systems and the capability figures from the previous day's review were real and accurate and she was not going to minimize them. But the doctrine that governed how those systems were used was defensive in orientation and humanity had no territorial ambitions beyond its current systems. The ships existed to ensure that humanity's security did not depend on the continued benevolence of others. They did not exist to project force against anyone. The distinction mattered and she wanted it on the record. The third point was the shortest. She said humanity valued its Galactic Council membership. Genuinely, not instrumentally. The Council represented something worth being part of. A framework for collective stability across species that had every historical reason to be in conflict with each other and had chosen to build something cooperative instead. Humanity wanted to be a productive part of that. Humanity wanted the relationship to work. That had been true 11 years ago when they joined and it was true now and the Titan class did not change it. If anything, the Titan class made it more true because a species that was secure in its own position was a more reliable partner than one that wasn't. She picked up her notes. She thanked the Council for the review and for their time. She said she hoped the session had been useful. Then she walked to the door and went through it and it closed behind her. The chamber was quiet. Not the stunned quiet of the observation deck or the processing quiet of the capability review or the focused uncomfortable quiet of the emergency session. Something different. The quiet of a room that has received 3 clear points from a person who meant all of them and is now sitting with what the 3 points together actually say. The Thessari envoy Kala was looking at the closed door. She had been looking at it since Webb walked through it. Her expression was the analytical one she wore when she was running something through her assessment process. Not reaction, calculation. Third attaché Vaughn in the outer ring had his computation unit out. He was not running numbers this time. He appeared to be writing something. The Drenali senior representative was speaking quietly to the attaché beside her. Whatever she was saying was too low for the room to hear. The Oresi ambassador sat at the main table with his hands folded in front of him and looked at the presenter's position where Webb had been standing. The single page of notes she had set face down was still there on the surface. She had not taken it with her. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked around the table. He had the expression he had worn at the end of the emergency session. The particular expression of a very experienced person doing the work of updating a model. But it had moved on from where it had been yesterday. Yesterday it had been the expression of someone sitting with an error. Today it was the expression of someone who had processed the error and was now asking what came next. He said she meant all three of those points. It was not a question. It was an observation made for the room's benefit because sometimes the obvious thing needed to be said before the conversation could move to what was built on top of it. The Thessari envoy said yes. She had watched Webb deliver the capability review and she had watched her deliver the 3 points, and both times what she had seen was the same thing. Someone saying exactly what they meant, no more and no less, with no visible gap between what they were saying and what they were thinking. It was, she said, a quality she did not encounter as frequently as the profession suggested she should. The Oresi ambassador nodded. He said, "For 11 years we made decisions about our relationship with humanity based on an assessment that was wrong. We assessed them as a junior member that was still finding its footing and needed to be managed within the framework we had built. We made that assessment based on where they started. We did not revise it as the evidence changed because we were not asking the questions that would have made the evidence visible. That is the error. That is what we are accountable for." He paused. He said, "The question in front of us now is not how we correct the error in our files. The question is what kind of relationship we actually want to build with a species that did all of this quietly, said nothing about it until a routine procedure required them to, and then walked in here and told us exactly why they did it in 12 words and 3 points and meant every syllable." The chamber was quiet again. The note-taker had stopped typing. He would write in his personal record that evening that this was the moment the session felt like it had moved from the territory of crisis management into something else. Something that did not have a standard procedural category but that felt more significant than most of what the standard categories covered. Outside in the external approach berth, the Resolute's navigation lights were cycling through their departure pre-check sequence. The identification beacon had shifted from idle to departure broadcast. The drive systems were warming to operational status in the gradual and orderly way of something that was built well and operated by people who took care of it. In the Docking Authority control room, coordinator Vel was at her morning post with her coffee. She watched the Resolute's departure sequence on her display with the focused professional attention that the departure of any vessel from Council space required, and also with something that was not strictly part of the professional attention, which was the specific awareness of having been the first person to send the message that started all of this. She watched the approach display where the Resolute signature was moving toward the jump point in the clean and steady way of something that knew where it was going. It reached the jump point. It went through. The display showed the standard post-transit signature, and then the corridor was clear and the Resolute was gone and the approach display returned to its normal quiet state. Vel picked up her coffee. Drank some of it. In the chamber the session was still running. The question the Oresi ambassador had put to the room was a real one and the room was doing real work on it. Not the crisis management of the emergency session but something more constructive and more forward-looking. The kind of conversation that happened when a significant thing had been processed far enough to move from reaction to response. The single page of notes sat face down on the presenter's surface. A staff member would collect it later when the room was cleared. They would flip it over out of standard tidying procedure and see that it contained 3 numbered points in clear handwriting. The points were exactly what Webb had said. Word for word. Nothing extra.